Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I travel back and revisit every live show I've seen from 1975 to the present. What were you doing on this day, say 12 years ago? What do you remember right now as you listen to this? Whenever in time that may be, what were you doing on this day, today, 12 years ago? Can you even remember anything about what was happening in your life at that time, right off the top of your head? Where did you live? Who did and didn't you know at that time? Was it 3 lifetimes ago, or have things pretty much been routine and unchanged in your life since then? Maybe you remember it easily because it was a special birthday, or your perfect wedding, or the day you knew you'd made it, or because it brought death into your life, or something happened and things were never the same again. Or was it a day when you worked, laughed, or loafed, looked out a window, worked in your garden, made a cup of Costa Rican coffee, but now all of those moments are lost forever to time? If you were to look it up on a calendar or look back through a journal, would that unlock memories once forgotten, now back on the mental hard drive? And is that sweetness or is it poison? How much of what you remember is the product of conscious or unconscious self-editing? How much does what you remember from the past color how you think about today? And how much does the present shape how you remember the past? Hey there, everyone. I'm your host, Various Artists, and welcome to another episode of the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast series. Now, there's been a bit of a delay between episodes, so apologies, but I'm now back with episode 14, concert number 6, and my very first concert of the 1980s. And episode 14 is called The Fine Art of Resurfacing, the Boomtown Rats with B.B. Gabor at the London Gardens, London, Ontario, Canada, Wednesday, March 19th, 1980, and the concert was $7. I'm going to start announcing the ticket price. I put it on the blog, but that's another fascinating factor as well, is not only have ticket prices gone up, but it's more than inflation. Shows certainly are much more expensive these days because that's the primary way musicians make money. Back then it was more album sales. But anyway, so this was a $7 show, and I'll be getting to all the hijinks and buffoonery very soon. And in the podcast, I'll reminisce about the toast of Dublin, pulling into London, Ontario, while at a career peak. I'll also be joined a bit later on, once again, by special guests. Yes, special guests. Now, Special is a longtime friend of mine now in Leeds in the UK, but was a London, Ontario resident at the time, was at the show. We didn't know each other just yet. It was a couple of years before we met, but we were both at this show. And he's here once again to share his memories, just as he did in episode 3, concert number 007 on the Ramones and the Demix at Centennial Hall, which took place 2 months after this gig. And definitely check out that episode. That's one of the most memorable gigs of my life, and special guests actually went to an album signing with the Ramones there, so he has some pretty interesting stories to add as well. Just a reminder that we have our My Life in Concert YouTube channel, where we have other videos, as well as I post the podcast there as well, so they can be accessed online. We also have our Facebook and Instagram pages. We're really behind the Instagram. I keep saying we're going to develop it. We will, but there's a lot on the Facebook page. And now I have MyLifeInConcert.com playlists available on Spotify that go with the episodes, as well as just some others that I've put together. And you can identify all of those playlists that I put there for My Life in Concert because they all begin with MLIC prompt, sort of the greater than symbol. And of course, the podcast can be heard on the MyLifeInConcert.com blog. We also have lots of other stuff on the blog that I post as well. There's visual links to videos, and of course, you can hear the podcast on our Buzzsprout home, Spotify, and many fine podcasting sites. Also, if you were at any of the gigs that I've been talking about, or this one today, go on Facebook, the blog, YouTube, and share your memories of the gig, what you remember from the show. I'm looking for input from others. It's always great to get different perspectives of how people experience things. All right, so episode 13, the previous episode, took place at the Polish Hall in London, Ontario, Canada, in November of '79. And it's a show about the local punk community and the bands that were there that night, NFG, the Sinners, and the Regulators. And there will be a show coming up way down the line where I'm going to be looking at the London punk scene in general. So again, if you were part of that world and are interested in talking and sharing your thoughts, get a hold of me at info@mylifeinconcert.com, or contact me through Facebook or the website or whatever. So you're starting to notice that as, my series progresses sequentially, we're getting into a bit more frequency of gigs, just by a little bit. But what's really interesting, in between November of '79 and this gig, that was the beginning of November, and this gig is in the middle of March. Those 4.5 months in between these gigs ended up being a very important time, interesting time for me culturally in Canada and me personally. Now, first off, I've talked about how I was following the punk and new wave bands from New York, Ramones, Patti Smith Television, before I'd even heard them through Rock Scene, and I've discussed this before. And I've also mentioned how, unlike England, where I went to England in '77, these acts really had almost no impact over here. This was very much an underground thing, and most of the bands from England or the UK or homegrown here in Canada, none of them had really made any, with a handful of exceptions, like Elvis Costello, for instance, the Police, the more tuneful and commercial, and nobody had really made much of a breakthrough here. There was a sea change between the latter part of '79 and especially early 1980, and it just kept going, where a lot of these bands, well, not a lot, there's a number of bands that broke through in Canada in a big cultish way. And certainly, the Boomtown Rats are one. For the first time really here, some of these bands broke through, and there was a bit more openness to some of the new music, and it started to trickle down into the mainstream of the culture. And so that was interesting. It hadn't happened before, and that was kind of the switch. So the other thing from this 4.5-month period that was very significant to me, the first was the larger cultural one. On a more personal note, there was also a big sea change. Now, in episode 13, the show at the Polish Hall with the local punk bands, one of the things I discuss in that episode is, I was 16 going on 17 through this point. I turned 17 in December of '79. And I knew almost no one my own age who was into this music. In Britain, because it had mainstream exposure, you had young, genuine teenagers who were into it. Over here, and this music was very underground, you didn't hear about it, so the people who were into it here were all well into their 20s. As I said, I knew no one my own age that was into this music. And that changed because I met two friends in high school. Actually, no, that's not true, because I did have my friend Autobahn, who I'd introduced to, but we were really going our separate ways at this point. And I met two people who would be great friends for many years, certainly in the next few years of my life. And one is someone who I introduced in the Ramones. They were both introduced in the Ramones episode, Lady B and Count Mara, who sadly I just recently found out passed away 17 years ago. Very sad for me to find out. Anyway, they were into all the punk stuff and all the new types of bands. So finally, I had same age friends who were into this stuff. So I always remember that period of the 70s turning into the 80s as a really exciting and interesting time in both my personal and wider life. So anyway, now I'm going to skip ahead 30 years to when I started the blog in the summer of 2010. And I wrote this initial entry for the Boomtown Rats later in 2010 and published it. About the original blog itself, which is now there as a blog and podcast, I came up with the idea for the My Life in Concert blog on opensalon.com, which was this offshoot site from salon.com where they had amateur writers publishing it. It was a great thing that went for a few years, and I'd been reading it, and I wanted to get involved, but I wanted to do something with a focus. As I discussed in the introductory episode, I came up with the idea of writing about all the concerts I'd ever seen. So during the late winter of 2010 and then the early spring, I spent some time drafting my first few pieces to see if I liked the results. And once I was satisfied, I sort of typed away because I wanted to have a backlog that I could sort of put up over time because it took a while to write these things out. Now, among the decisions I made was, of course, I'd seen a lot of local bands and stuff like this, and also there were just some gigs. There wasn't much to say. So I knew I couldn't do full entries for every show. And my way of deciding which gigs would get full entries was there either had to be a strong review component or some story to tell or a situation or element that would allow me to riff on an idea or a theme. Meanwhile, all the other shows that don't fit into that, I'll be discussing in a series of compilation episodes. So the other thing was, too, is that I wanted to name each blog piece using a song or album title by the artist I was talking about that in some way reflected what I wanted to say in the piece. So in writing these, I was going back, doing a lot of researching, re-listening to albums, looking through a lot of old stuff to sort of get a feel and trigger memories and that kind of thing from the time. So when it came to this episode, I knew right away it was going to be called The Fine Art of Surfacing. Now, that's the title of the album they were touring on when I saw them, and it was their biggest album, their one true international blockbuster. The idea of what I wanted to write about in this piece, because in going back, I was starting to think about the very nature of memory, writing and working all these, and then again, now 10 years later, continuing the process. And The Fine Art of Surfacing perfectly encapsulates what it was I wanted to write about then and talk about today. Namely that the title contains the word surfacing, which for my purposes here refers to the notion of becoming visible via commercial success, something that was clearly on the minds of the band as they went to write and record their follow-up to their second album. Now, for a bit of background, the band formed in Dublin, Ireland in the mid-70s and were sort of a high-energy rock act that dovetailed with the punk thing when it happened. And even though not exactly a punk band, there was a lot of people that were sort of in that category or had offshoots of that, and they all sort of fell under that umbrella. And as I've mentioned, I went to in other episodes, I went to the UK in 77, and one of the singles I brought back was the first Boomtown Rats single, Lookin After No. 1, which was in the charts at the time, and I really enjoyed when I heard it. It's actually a really interesting 3-track single because there's 2 tracks on the B-side. You have the full-on sort of high-energy punk and FU theme and vibe of the A-side, Lookin After No. 1. Then on the back, they had a tune, Born to Burn, which sounds like, it's even more in that vein. It sounds like the New York Dolls at 78 RPM. But then they also do this live version of Robert Parker's 1966 R&B hit, Barefoot. And so you know that they were coming from that, R&B, older rock background. And that's kind of what they did in the next few years. They were part of sort of the punk new wave world, but they also sort of came from some classic rock, especially in the UK context, sort of more older classic rock elements and sort of blended them together. When I got back, I eventually picked up the debut LP, and it was sort of Boomtown Rats mania in my head for the next few years. Meanwhile, they really ascended in the UK. Bob Geldof, many years before Sir Bob and Live Aid, he was one of the big mouthpieces in the UK music press at the time, and they were big stars at this moment. In fact, they broke an even bigger in 1978 with their second album, A Tonic for the Troops. Now, that contained 3 big chart hits, the most notable of the 3 being their first British UK #1, Rat Trap, a very sort of Bruce Springsteen-ish kind of song. And it's one of the best tracks they ever did. So, surfacing in a larger commercial sense must have been on their minds when they were creating this successor. And it worked, as I said, the Fine Art of Surfacing, and its accompanying 45, I Don't Like Mondays, became major hits in almost every key international sort of Western market except the U.S., which is a trend. I don't think, when I started writing this blog 10 years ago, it wasn't till I was writing this and doing sort of chart research that I realized just how many tunes coming from sort of the left field of British and American rock at the time were these huge hits everywhere except the U.S. So, I mean, we got the same dross, but, we had some good stuff in the mix. So we have Surfacing, the title, and the idea that they're going for a larger commercial market, but the title also has the fine art of surfacing, which for me brings up that eternal struggle of any artist who starts out as acclaimed and on the fringes, but who ultimately wants a larger mainstream audience. That dilemma, how and where to draw the line that will equitably balance artistic integrity versus tempering the rough edges enough to attract attention in the wider marketplace. It's a battle that very few rectify in any kind of satisfactory fashion for either artist or audience. The eternal dilemma for somebody who wants to be more than just an entertainer. Both album and single became huge hits here in Canada, but I, a fan since, of course, buying that single I was talking about and had followed them, wasn't too impressed. Following what I thought was such a great album in Tonic for the Troops, I found Surfacing a little bit overly glitzy, streamlined, bland, and sort of nakedly aspirational in the quick buck rather than the artistic sense. That's what I felt at the time, okay? So we'll get back to that. So in an era with an embarrassment of slipstream riches, I mean, 79 through 81 is just such a golden period for that kind of, alternative music. It was frustrating that this band I'd loved had become big, but with what I saw as really compromised music. Now, I was still glad they were reaching a larger audience. I've talked about how I just do not get into they just have to be my special band, and if anyone else knows them, I'm dumping them. Not interested. People who truly love music don't think that way. I just wish that they'd been able to do it with tunes that I could get more behind. Again, this is what I thought at the time. And I Don't Like Mondays. It was just everywhere here. You heard it on the radio all the time. It was a big cultural thing. And it sort of irked me that this sort of Elton John-ish piano ballad was representing, this sort of more rocked out band that I like. Not to mention that Elton John and Bernie Taupin too had already sort of covered this topic in an amazing song on Caribou called Ticking in 1974. Regardless, when a London, Ontario stop appeared as a tour date, I was pretty excited to be seeing them. A group whose overall output I'd loved, even if I wasn't as much into the new one. And again, not to mention, I had seen very few of the bands who had come out in the last few years. So I was pretty excited about this gig. And I thought it was cool that they could break through and be playing a place like the London Gardens, which was pretty big. So I'm now going to switch over to my interview with special guests, where we discuss our memories of the show. And then I'll continue on afterwards with additional thoughts of my own on the show and how this all relates to the things I've come to realize about memories and interpreting the past, a process that's come about through doing the My Life in Concert blog and now podcast. I'll also mention the sound of the interview is from a Skype chat, so there may be a little bit of audio degradation. I'm recording on a professional mic and professional recording program. So when I go to some of these interviews that have been done, there's a little bit of degradation in the sound, but I'm sure you'll survive. Okay, so anyway, here we go. I'm speaking with special guests once again from the UK. Say hello, special guests.
Hello, special guests.
So To start off with, your name Special Guest that I'm using,
Yeah.
and my name Various Artists, they actually both came from you. Do you remember how those names came about?
I have an idea. Did it come from? Because I used to always like look at the back of say the music papers like The Enemy years ago, and they'd be like a band would be on, and it would say plus special guests, and like, oh God, they must be a really good band. They're all over the place, just opening up for everybody. And then like compilation albums feature, was always various artists. So I'm presuming that's where they come from.
Ding, ding,
If I
ding, ding,
remember.
ding, ding. You are correct. Absolutely correct. That's where it came from. So when I started this, I remember using Various
Yeah.
Artists. So when I brought you in, I thought, well, I've already used that name, so Special Guests it is.
Yes.
Okay, to start with, maybe tell us a little bit about how you came to be at this show. Were you a fan of the band before, or how did you come to know about the Boomtown Rats?
Yeah, I was a fan beforehand. I bought one or two of their albums. Um, I think I got to know of them through the British press. My parents bought me the 7-inch version, 7-inch single of I Don't Like Mondays.
Okay.
When they'd come over to the UK, when we were still living in Canada, they came over to the UK for a holiday, just the two of them. And I said, just bring back whatever's number one at the time. Bring it back. And that was it. That was number one at the time, was I Don't Like Mondays. But I'm sure I saw them on TV on Midnight Special or something. I recall seeing them.
I think it was Fridays.
Fridays. I
Do you
remember
remember
seeing
that?
them on TV and really, really liking them. And then, I was a fan, so I knew who they were before going, and knew quite a lot of the songs beforehand.
So do you have any memories about hearing about the show, getting the tickets, sort of the pre-show story, or is any of that in your mind?
No.
Okay, well, that's short and succinct.
I can just about, as we're talking about it, I can just about remember seeing the ad in the paper. I don't remember much of the build up to it. I went to see them with a couple of friends from school, the same two guys I went to see Ramones with. But it's funny, I think I remember again we got a ride there from their mum, I think. I don't remember much of the build up, to be honest with you.
Same here with myself. I can't really remember much of the build-up in that regard. I had been a fan since '77 because when I was in the UK, I bought their Lookin After #1 single because that was in the charts.
Yeah.
And I had followed them since and was certainly excited to be seeing them, but I can't remember the build-up. I was really excited because, of course, we were both here in London, Ontario, and a lot of these bands from the UK that we were listening to, we didn't really have much of an avenue to see them. They were always playing in Toronto, but when we were that age, it's not always easy to get there when you're young.
Yeah.
And of course, I Don't Like Mondays became this massive hit here, and the album as well. So that was,
Yeah.
I also remember, go ahead.
I was going to say, I remember being really surprised at how popular they became in Canada at the time. It just seemed a bit odd to me. I don't know why.
Well, that's my memory of that time, and and not only memory, it's a fact, is that the first few years, a lot of the new bands that were coming out, it was kind of the same here as with America. They really didn't make a dent. But starting at the end of '79 through 1980, a lot of the new bands were much more accepted and started to take off here because there was a whole pile of hits. There was XTC, Making Plans for Nigel.
Yeah.
The Clash's London Calling just missed the top 10 here. The Specials was in the top 20 albums here. So there's always been a bit of this history of you'll have this band that's huge in Britain. They're a really minor cult band in the States, and then here they're sort of in between.
Yeah.
And this is where This is where there was a big gap, and I didn't fully realize this until I started doing this series and started doing chart research, that there was a lot of big gaps between the US and Canada, specifically in this realm, the new groups.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, indeed, it was one of the biggest hits of the early part of that year.
Yeah, I remember that.
Now, do you have any memories about going to the gig, memories about the gig?
Yeah, I think we got there fairly early because we were probably all really excited because I think that was actually the first sort of, it was my first concert at London Gardens. In fact, I don't think I went to very many there.
Yeah.
And it was probably one of my first big gigs, sort of just with me and my friends.
Yeah.
Because before that, I think I either went with my sister or my mum and dad at the West End Fair or something like that. So I remember, really looking forward to it. And I think it was my first sort of big band of that ilk at that time that I went to see live. But I don't have any sort of memories of the build up to it. I just probably was very overly excited like I was for the Ramones. I went with a couple of friends from school, the same two friends that I went to see Ramones with. And I think we probably got there pretty early as well because we did manage to get fairly close to the front. But I don't think I went to very many gigs at that place, thinking back. I think I only ever went, the only other one I remember going to see there was Cheap Trick.
Oh, was that before or after?
That would have been after.
Yeah.
Because I went with my sister's boyfriend who was visiting from the UK at the time, and he went to the police picnic with us, so it would have been after.
Now, that's interesting. You said that you got up very close to the stage because it was an open, because with the London Gardens, it was an arena.
Yeah.
So you had all the seats going up at the side, but on the floor, it was just all open the way it used to be, and the way I still like it at sort of rock concerts that aren't sort of sit-down affairs. And so how close did you get to the stage?
Pretty close. Yeah, we didn't get right to the front. I'd say we might have been about maybe 6 people in front of us, maybe.
Nice.
From what I can remember.
Nice. That it's nice and close.
Yeah.
I went with my sister and, well, later he was my brother-in-law, and I think we were I know we were down on the floor, but I think we were maybe about halfway through the crowd kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Was it sold out? I can't remember.
It was about half full. The arena, I think, for concerts held 6,000 people, and I think it was about half full. Because I had I saw Bob Seger there, which I've talked about.
Yeah,
that was
I
packed.
To that. Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, I also, in 1988, saw Alice Cooper and Motorhead there.
Oh, yeah.
And I was there pretty much for Motorhead. I'm trying to think if there's any, I'm thinking there was another gig there, but I'm blanking on what that would be. Or maybe there wasn't, maybe just the 3. Now, B.B. Gabor opened the show. Do you remember B.B. Gabor?
I do remember B.B. Gabor, because I remember going, but I didn't know anything about him. Didn't know who he was, didn't know nothing. But I do remember him, his set, and liking it. I remember I liked it. I think I liked him enough I bought his album.
Mm-hmm.
So he had like a sort of a hit, didn't he, with Niet Niet Soviet Jewelry or something, was that?
Yeah, it used to get played on college radio all the time.
Yeah.
That's why I knew it from radio.
Yeah, so I remember buying it, and I think he did a version of Big Yellow Taxi, Joni Mitchell, on his album. And I remember listening to it not long ago on YouTube. Yeah, sort of listening back because I was remembering about seeing him, and I thought, God, I've not listened to that for ages. It hasn't really aged very well. Mind you, I don't think it wasn't the greatest back then, but it wasn't terrible. But it hasn't aged very well.
Yeah, sadly, he later went on to kill himself.
Because I read about that. Because I looked him up to see, I wonder what he's doing now. And I thought, oh, okay, he's not doing anything.
Well, that's tricky these days all around because it seems like every day someone that meant something to me dies these days. It's just we're getting to that time, but very sad.
Yeah.
But I remember he was well received, and he kind of had that first album that was popular here because, again, part of that whole sort of new wave explosion in Canada that happened right at the cusp of the turn of the decade.
Yeah.
Now, as for the actual show itself, what are your memories from the show?
I remember singing along. I remember being loud. I remember Bob Geldof was just all over the place from what I can remember. I can remember Johnny Fingers in his pajamas at the piano.
I definitely remember that as well. His trademark pajamas.
Yeah. I remember thinking, though, I thought, God, he's really good. I thought he was a really good musician. He came, he looked like he knew what he was doing. He just wasn't pretending.
His trademark as the wearing the pajamas all the time, that must have gotten tired after a certain point.
Yeah, probably thought, oh, God, not again. Do I have to? Mind you, maybe he just did it because he wanted to go straight to bed when he finished the gig. I can't be bothered putting any clothes on. I'll just get up and have something to eat and go to the gig and then go back to bed.
So those are the advantages.
Maybe he was just lazy. Yeah, he could have just been lazy.
I guess we'll never know.
I know, yeah. He's not with them anymore.
Oh, he's not?
No, because I saw them again a couple of years ago, maybe. Was it last year or a couple of years ago? I saw them at a retro festival in Leeds, and it was he wasn't there. I remember he wasn't there. I think there was only about 4 of them, the originals.
Because I know they have reformed recently. I thought it was the original band, although I haven't checked out all the members, but I know they reformed and have a new album out, which I've been wanting to hear but haven't got to. There's been so much released this year.
Yeah. They were good second time around as well, in comparison. I can't, because it's hard to sort of compare how they were, when it was so long ago, when you're trying to. I remember liking them then, and recently they were good. Except this time, obviously, Bob Geldof had long white hair, which he didn't have that time.
That tends to happen.
Yeah. I mean, he was swearing a lot this last time, which after reading comments, I think on Facebook and the festival, a lot of people were complaining. Yeah, he was swearing too much. Oh, there was children in the audience. Oh, it was so bad it made us leave. Oh, God, get a life.
Exactly. I mean, this is a band that came out of the whole punk scene in the 70s. So, let's
I know, exactly. I mean, everybody, you're adults. I'm sure your children would have heard worse in the streets.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So, but anyway, so getting back to that, that first one. I just remember it being really energetic. From what I can remember, everybody seemed to be enjoying it. Everybody was singing along to all the songs. Well, most of them, probably.
That was my memory, too. A lot of people were really into it. And a lot of people knew, clearly there were new fans, but there were old ones there, too, who had been following them. And I remember, that's what I remember, a lot of the sing-alongs. And as you mentioned with Geldof, I remember him being really energetic. But that's the thing, though, if you think they were just blowing up over here at the time. And as I've talked about in other podcasts, that can sometimes be the best time to see a band when they're just they're taking off. They know it's happening and there's this excitement around them, but there's an excitement for the artist because they've been working towards this and they're getting liftoff, and you have that almost manic energy that comes around. So it can be a particularly exciting point to see someone at that. Those circumstances.
Yeah, you're right.
I also remember the set. they had this big set that for me in my mind almost looked like Hollywood squares. Because it had this, it was kind of like it was a grid that lit up in the back, and it looked like 9 units. So it kind of looked like the stars would come in for Hollywood squares. It looked like they'd taken the set. That's what came to my mind.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. As soon as you said it, yeah, I can remember. I remember, yeah, the X's, there was like X's and O's and stuff.
I remember the big set. And also they had a big canvas backdrop of the Fine Art of Resurfacing cover as well.
Yes. Yes, I remember that now as well.
And then also when they did Having My Picture Taken, I remember Geldof saying, anyone with a camera come up on the stage. And a whole bunch of kids went up. And it's one of those things where it was a good concept for the song. The kids are excited on stage, but once you have the band up there and the kids up there, there's this kind of awkward moment of, we have to be up here for 3.5 minutes and nobody quite knows what to do. That's how I remember it.
Yeah. I remember freaking out going, why didn't I bring my camera? Oh, I was so upset. I was thinking, I wanted to be up there as well. It's like, oh.
The other thing I think of in terms of the cameras, what I remember back then is, well, up until you had cameras on phones, you generally couldn't bring cameras into shows, not by the time I was going. Yeah. So that's kind of interesting, because I would not have thought to have brought a camera to something like that for that reason. So I guess they must have waived that, or I was not aware of it. But that's also something like, how come everyone brought cameras? I wish same thing with yourself. I wish I'd been thinking the same thing.
Yeah. And but back then as well, quite a lot of the cameras would have all had them flashes on. The ones you just have to stick on the top.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Man, it's incredible to think of how we used to take a few photographs, and today everything is photographed.
I remember once I snuck a camera into when I went to see Prince in Birmingham over here, and it was slightly different, but it was,
when was this?
It was around, what year was it? It was around the time of Graffiti Bridge. It was just before Graffiti Bridge came out, I think, because they showed the extended video of Thieves in the Temple before he came on. And they were saying, you're not allowed cameras, you're not allowed to bring cameras in, you have to. So I snuck mine in down into my sock, managed to get it in. I'm taking pictures, and then I got hauled out into the hallway.
Yeah.
I just dragged out by security, and they said, you have to put it away. Said if Prince's security found you doing it, you would have been kicked out. So it's like, okay.
Because that's what went through my mind when you said that. Because there's a Prince show coming up way down the line. It is the single most irritating and frustrating concert I have ever been to in my life. That's a whole other story. But that's what I thought of. The security was beyond the beyond. And they literally had scores of people going up and down rows checking to make sure, like, even if somebody was checking a message on their phone, they were on them. Like, anyway, that's a whole other show coming out. It was very disappointed and discouraged by that show. So I was thinking, wow, how did that work when you got it in?
Yeah.
Because I also remember there's a Lou Reed show at Roy Thompson Hall. And I went with someone who got a camera, and she took all these pictures, and they came right up to her and said, take the film out right now. And she had to take the film out of her camera, which had other shots, which of course got ruined. But, oh well. The other big thing from this night that I really remember is it was freezing in there.
I was going to say that earlier. I remember it being cold.
Because it was this huge open shed, under-insulated, that was often used for hockey games and stuff.
Yes.
And I'd been to that Bob Seger concert, which was the reverse. It was a May 24th weekend that was super hot, and it was just like a steam bath in there. This was the complete opposite. You were just, even though there was thousands of people there, you were just shivering. It was so cold in there.
I remember that.
Were there any numbers in particular that you remember jumping out at you from the show?
Well, I remember I Don't Like Mondays because I remember at the end it was Johnny Fingers I think he was playing for a little while because everybody was cheering him on.
Hmm.
I think that was when I do remember him playing on his own for a little bit. Um, no, I can't remember anything. Yeah, someone's looking at me, obviously because of the picture thing.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what I remember. That's the number
yeah,
that
but
sticks out in
that,
my mind is someone's
yeah,
looking at you.
but
Well, having
nothing.
my picture taken, but someone's looking at you, that opening track, which is my
Yeah,
favorite on the album, that sticks in my mind. But I mean, this is 40 years ago.
yeah, yeah. Slept since then.
Yes, exactly.
But I can remember I found a bootleg copy of it, of the concert.
Really?
Yeah, it's in one of the record stores in London, and I was going to buy it. It's like, I'm really excited. Oh, the bootleg, oh, I think I'll buy it. But then somebody who worked there said, oh, yeah, I've listened to this. It's not very good recording. All you can hear is people singing along, the crowd, and not the band. So it's like, all right, okay, I won't waste my $5.
Yeah, because generally all the bootlegs and stuff, they also cost a fortune.
Yeah. And $5 was a bit of money for me back then.
Oh yeah, that would be more like
Probably
about
could have bought an album for $5, I think, probably.
you could bet probably yeah, you almost had enough for pretty much about an album back then. So that was
Yeah,
probably more like about 25, $30 today or something like that.
yeah, yeah.
So after the gig, you did see them again. How many years later was it? We were talking about this earlier.
38, maybe 38 years later. Yeah,
Drop in the bucket.
yeah. So yeah, and they were really good. They were excellent. Really enjoyed them. This time around, Bob Geldof was his usual self, and he was still enthusiastic, still jumping around the stage. This time he was wearing flares. He said
Oh,
he said he was trying to make them popular again.
oh, I'm glad that didn't take off.
No, I know. It was only a couple of years ago.
Yeah. That's
Uh,
one style trend I don't mind leaving was fun at the time, but let's leave it in the past.
I know, yeah, yeah. They get caught up. You can't walk in them proper.
Well, because especially back in the days, people were tripping over on them,
Yeah,
especially if they had what they call them elephant pants. Do you remember those? Those were like the
yeah,
mega flares.
yeah,
Anyway,
yeah,
luckily that is one thing I don't mind consigning to the past.
yeah. I know. But this time, I remember one song that really stuck out to me this time because I don't know, I was surprised to hear them do was "She's So Modern."
Ah,
They did really. I think that was one. I think that could have been the first song that they came out to because they came out. They had a song because they recorded a few years ago a song called the Boomtown Rats. Have you heard it?
no, no, I haven't.
It's more like a instrumental, and they're going "Boomtown Rats" like a chant.
Hmm.
Boomtown Rats, and you have to look it up. So that sort of like then they came on, and then they started out with "She's So Modern," which was one of my favorite songs of theirs. What about the one after the Fine Art of Surfacing? Mondo.
Mondo Bongo.
Yes.
So that one I wasn't very keen on. I know someone who had it and I heard it and I just thought it was weak. And after that, my sort of Rats mania kind of petered off. Yourself?
Um, yeah, I remember I bought it and was a little bit disappointed with it, but I still liked it, and I think I still do. I mean, I've not heard the full album. I've got I've heard tracks, and I enjoyed it, but like yourself, I think after that it kind of sort of waned. I sort of didn't really pay attention much after that for years and years and years.
Yeah, because maybe that's something I should bring up on Spotify and listen to. Because what was the single off that album? I'm trying to remember.
Is it Banana Republic?
Right, right.
I think
Which,
that was one of them, or just the one. I'm not sure which.
but that from that point, I sort of lost interest, and then they sort of fell apart, and then of course reformed years later.
Yeah,
So once again, thank you, special guests, for dropping by and sharing your memories on the Boomtown Rats.
It's all right. It's always a pleasure.
And you will be coming up in episode 15, the next episode, where we're talking about the first of the 3 police picnics, this one in 1981. So listeners, stay tuned for more special guests.
Bye.
So to throw in a few other things that I remember from the show, we had talked about Bob Geldof, and I was really thinking, he reminded me a lot of Mick Jagger with those sort of moves and presence, and I'm sure, that was not unintentional. Also, who I did and didn't go see the show with, as I mentioned, I had gone with my sister and her new boyfriend, who had met just a little bit before she had. But this was one of our first times all going out together, so that's a memory. Meanwhile, my new friends, Lady B and Count Mara. Now, Lady B and I had dated briefly, and then we'd broken up, and so we weren't really, it was kind of like a not talking period, so that's why she was not at the show. Count Mara wasn't a fan of the band, and he really wasn't a fan of big shows. It's something that going through this process, like 10 years ago and now, when I was reviewing the gigs and who I went with, is we were such great friends for years, and music was our bond. We were hugely into music and records and all this sort of thing. And it's really amazing how few shows we attended together. There's very, very few that we went to together. So I think he was more a home and drinking at the bar, but not so much going out, especially to bigger concerts. I don't know why, but that's just how some people are. Also, in the interview with special guests, we talked about the Hollywood Squares type scaffolding and structure. And I remember my sister, who was the least punk purist of us all, of that, being the one really kind of irritated by it. This is not what it's supposed to be about, big light shows and that sort of. So my sister was the hardcore, punk purist that night. But the biggest thing that I haven't discussed is, as I had mentioned in episode 13, I really didn't know anyone else my age into any of this. This show marked a big sea change because, again, over the last few months, this had entered the mainstream, and now younger people were getting into this music. So one of the big things I remember is the amount of people at this show who were in and around my age, which had not been the case before. I also, in that last episode, I talked about how late 79 was kind of the end of that first era of the punk scene in London. And I think this had something to do with it. And again, that musical snobbery thing, which I'm so against. But I think there was a lot of people where this is our little scene. And then once it became, oh, young people are listening to this, and it's like, I'm too cool for school. And that really created a mark right about now in that line between the first scene and the second one and of the subsequent ones that followed. There really was a sea change in terms of who the audience was and could be for these types of bands. And also, then, of course, it would trickle down. A lot of these kids would be getting into hardcore and all that sort of thing. So, and then, of course, at the other end, you had people getting into the electropop. And so this is where, in many ways, what had happened with punk just splits and prisms into a whole variety of options, choices, and avenues. So following on from talking about memories, I now want to reconnect with what I was talking about right back at the beginning. And that's the fine art of resurfacing, as in memory. When I was writing the original blog entry 10 years ago, two things that were then recent got me thinking sort of about that amorphous nature of memory while working on this series. The first was really a case of kismet, and namely that we had purchased a turntable in late 2009 right after our wedding when we got married, and we got a lot of money, so we bought a killer sound system, and I hadn't had a platter for a number of years. So we got this turntable. I hadn't had a proper working one probably like 15 years. So, and I went on this binge of listening to all this vinyl that I didn't have digitally on CD or couldn't find online, that sort of thing, and went through this huge replaying of a lot of these albums I hadn't heard sometimes in decades. Now, it was just after that I decided to do the My Life in Concert blog and started working on those initial entries. And having that turntable turned out to be a godsend, because as I was working on each entry, I wanted to go back and listen to the music of the artists I was writing about. And a number of these albums, I had not been able to hear them for a number of years. They just had been unavailable to me. So it was incredible to listen to them with fresh ears. And most of the albums I was listening to not only sounded as good as I remembered, there was a number in particular. Dave Edmunds' Repeat When Necessary. This is what I wrote in the blog. That was one. The Jam, Setting Suns. Elvis Costello's Trust. That really jumped out as, okay, this is even better than what I remember. This came to a halt when I hit the Boomtown Rats albums and I started working on this entry. Now, if you would have asked me around the time of this gig to rank the Boomtown Rats catalog, Tonic for the Troops would have been number one. Then there's their first album, their self-titled first album, and then Fine Art of Resurfacing would be sort of in the third. And then 30 years later, I'm writing this blog entry, and I go back and listen to these albums, and I don't know why. But 10 years ago, when I wrote the blog entry, I couldn't get into A Tonic for the Troops. I just couldn't get into it. Some of the things I wrote at the time, it was irksome, overly effervescent, competing styles and goals, conflicted and unresolved. Oh man, that's harsh. But I remember thinking, wow, this isn't working for me. I really don't like this. It kind of got on my nerves. Now, in terms of the Fine Art of Surfacing, that now sounded markedly superior in my mind, with some of the aspects that initially bothered me, like it being more streamlined, a little more focused, now acting as pluses. And also, I don't like Mondays. Again, you stand in line well, we're under COVID now, but even if you're in a line in a store here in Canada, it's normal to hear that cascading piano booming through, I don't know, Walmart speakers or whatever. But the thing is, when I hear that song now, completely removed from that era where I was so fed up of having had years of everything just being corporate and sweet that I wanted something raw and real. Of course, so now that that time has gone and I still like that stuff from the period, I just see I Don't Like Mondays as a pop song, and it's an amazing pop song. It's brilliant. And the Fine Art of Surfacing in 2010 sounded like an amazing album. The first one, however, that I loved so much, the first side I thought was pretty good with some great songs. The second side was a real bit of a slog. It's just, okay, this isn't as good as I remember. But that was my memory. So in 2010, when I wrote this, I was talking about how, if somebody was to read this, oh, Tonic for the Troops, it's a real disappointment. Stay away from that one. But, Fine Art of Surfacing. Well, now it's 10 years later. And it's interesting because I wrote in the initial blog piece, and I quote, "Furthermore, rehearing all this past music in the present creates a new memory and revised marker. I could very well re-listen to them in 10 years' time," that's the albums, "and have a different take yet again, negating the value judgment drawn from this 2010 benchmark and realigning with my earlier impressions," unquote. Well, I called that one. For the podcast, I went back and again, 10 years later, 10 years later, right after this piece, and re-listened to the albums. And once again, I have a completely different take. Well, I have a different take. A Tonic for the Troops. Okay, as I said, I've reverted to 1978. I have no idea what I was thinking 10 years ago. I do not have any idea whatsoever, because the album sounds amazing now. As a matter of fact, I've been playing it repeatedly over the last few months. It's absolutely their best album. If you were going to go and buy a Boomtown Rats album, buy A Tonic for the Troops. And the Fine Art of Surfacing, okay, I'm still in 2010. I still think it sounds great. I think they are their two best albums. I completely undersold that one when it came out in 1980. I undersold A Tonic for the Troops when I revisited it 10 years ago. The first album, which I loved at the beginning, it's the weakest of the three. It's got its moments, but it's got some issue, and also some of the lyrics really have not traveled well. It's interesting because, again, let's say my turntable broke, all versions of this fell off everywhere, it wasn't on Spotify. If I was doing this podcast today, I would have to be relying on the memories from 10 years ago, even though that's not really how, or indicative of how I feel now. I've thought about this, and it feels like in doing this podcast, I'm collaborating with my younger self in this series, as if I'm collaborating with a separate person. And it's like I'm sending my 17-year-old self out to the front, for frontline coverage of gigs. And I'm basically taking what that person, my 17-year-old self, is reporting back to me about the time. And I can only go on what that 17-year-old is telling me. But it's me shaping those memories now, but I can't know for sure how I would react at this time. Going to a concert, I've talked about how I'm trying to look at the concert experience rather than just as music. And part of that experience is about who you are and what was going on in your life at the time. And so looking back always changes slightly depending on what's going on in your life right now. I've certainly had a lot of realizations about my life in, say the last 5-6 years. I've seen a lot of the machinery that was there in and around my life and how it was affecting me. And I feel like I've sort of pulled back the curtain, at the end of The Wizard of Oz. And that changes the lens and perspective that you see things through, meaning that you look back at the specifics of something that happened, but the interpretive meaning means that I now see a lot of my memories differently because I'm looking at them through a different and clearer lens. And that lens constantly shifts and grows as you get older. Again, which means maybe your memory, you're not living in it, you're just living with your interpretation. And how you feel about those things and how you see those things changes. So this is one of the tricky parts of doing something when you're looking back. And so I have to wonder, when I'm reporting to you about my concert experiences, how would I see them similarly or differently, better or worse now versus then? And how much was what I'm reporting back the context of the time and how it squares with maybe the context of the time now? In terms of reporting on, especially with the blog, I also, and they're up there still, was doing reviews on more contemporary shows. Well, it would be interesting when I revisit those, what sort of aspects from the show I might highlight now that I maybe didn't then, or have realizations that you can only have in retrospect, and how that will change what I have to say about the show. All of these ideas about the complexity of memory really came home also when writing the original blogs, because I had found my journals from many years before. Between mid-1986 and mid-1995, I intermittently wrote several volumes of journals. With the period from the fall of 88 through the summer of 1992 as particularly rich and detailed. I have used the notes already in one of the episodes. As you know, I began my series by looking at one concert from each of the decades that I've been a concert goer, and my entry for the 90s on Lollapalooza in 1992 featured me reading. I'd actually taken real-time notes during the day. And again, you can hear the episode, and there's this whole immediacy of me reporting things as they're happening. Not to mention, there's a pile of stuff in there I would have forgotten about and been lost to memory. I'd forgotten I'd even taken the notes that day. It wasn't till I went through the journals and it popped out and I went, oh wow, this is amazing. So when I started writing the blog in 2010, I'd remembered, wow, I wrote those journals for years. Where are they? And it took some digging, and I found them and read them, and oh wow, what an experience. It was a really tumultuous time in my life. Well, I've had a few of them. That was one of them. And I began journaling as a lot of people do when you're in a really tough spot in your life. So again, the immediacy, so much of my life came rushing back to me, painful, really awful things, with the words providing me with like a direct IV back into that time and why. But there's also so much great stuff too, really great, happy times. Nights out at bars and shows, really killer parties, a night spent just sitting in with friends, playing Scrabble, going to events. And of course, there's all these minor occurrences from your day-to-day life or people you'd forgotten about, and they just come rushing back. Of course, the other thing is I wanted to check my own memories. And what I found was this. I was pleasantly surprised that most things I had remembered were correct. In terms of memories of things happening, what was in my mind for what was the time of the journals, it matched maybe about 90%. So my memory was pretty good. Unfortunately, because of some stuff that happened in the last decade, my memory's been a little bit Swiss cheesed. So I'm also glad I have the blogs from 10 years ago as well as the journals. So it wasn't so much that I got things wrong. I did, of course, get some things wrong, but that wasn't so much it. It's what I had left out. Not so much what I got wrong is what was left out. All sorts of details of, went to a show and I remember going with 3 people and then I read and there's 6 of us there. And it's like, yes, of course, of all these little things that happened. So when you're doing this sort of thing, it's great to have because it helps you sort out the memories in your head and how you remember things. Not to mention, too, that for an endeavor like this, where I'm talking about shows, once I hit that period, late 80s, early 90s, I'm also going to be able to give you details about shows at a whole other level. So for the concerts from that period, I'm going to be able to bring in a whole other level of details about the shows by people such as the Smiths, Paul McCartney, Lou Reed, Neil Young, Sonic Youth, Keith Richards at the Fox Theatre in Detroit on his own, as well as the Rolling Stones, Laura Nyro, the Waterboys, and several Lollapaloozas. I've already done the one from 1992. So, memories are tricky and sometimes selective, but they change along with our lives and experiences, and how we interpret memories and view them are often colored by today. What we choose to reveal and expound upon, what we decide to bury, what is shaded, upgraded, or eliminated by our changing feelings, alliances, tastes, priorities, experience, insights, growth, and perspective. Writing about the past often relies so much about how we feel in the present, the two essentially becoming interdependent. Ostensibly, I was writing and now podcasting about then. But even when we're talking about then, in many ways we're talking about now. Despite their at times unreliable and patchwork nature, our resurfacing memories house some of the keys to whatever we've become and how we see ourselves and our personal histories through changing reflections on an unchanged past. But flawed as the process is, and for what it's worth, I shall continue trying to perfect the fine art of resurfacing with the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast series. Well, that wraps up episode 14 and my look back on the Boomtown Rats show in 1980, as well as pondering the nature of memory. Now, in terms of the next show in my concert series that I saw, I've already done a podcast for the next show. It was episode number 3, my highlighted show from the 1980s. It's concert number 7, and Here Today, Gone Tomorrow. So you can listen to that on the podcast. And it's the Ramones and the Demix, Centennial Hall, London, Ontario, Canada, May 20th, 1980. So 2 months after the Boomtown Rats. I've also done a podcast for the show after the Ramones, which is, of course, the Heatwave Festival, which took place August 23rd, 1980, and I did a 40th anniversary podcast on that. It's episode 10, and on the blog it's concert number 8A through D. It's a very long entry, and of course that was the festival with Talking Heads, Elvis Costello, Pretenders, B-52s, Rockpile, Teenage Head, etc., etc. So go listen to that one. That one in particular, it's long, but there's quite a story there, I assure you. Now, in the fall, I was supposed to be seeing 2 gigs, the fall of 1980, XTC in November and Bob Marley in December. Unfortunately, both of those gigs got canceled, and I've done a podcast about that too. My episode 9, A and B, I did it in 2 parts. Waiting in Vain, 20 performances I missed, updated to 22 between 1980 and 2020. I upgraded it for the shows I missed in 2020 because of COVID. Anyway, I talk about missing both of those shows and many others, shows by The Clash, U2, Simon and Garfunkel. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. Go listen to that. The next concert is in 1981, and that will be my next episode. Episode 15, concert number 9, The Boiler. The Police Picnic number 1, with The Police, The Specials, Iggy Pop, Killing Joke, The Go-Go's, Nash the Slash, John Otway and Wild Willie Barrett, The Payolas, Oingo Boingo, and the David Bendeth Band at the Grove, Oakville, Ontario, Canada, August 23rd, exactly a year to the date after Heatwave, 1981. It was actually the only show of 1981 that I saw, which is odd because, as you can see, I was seeing more shows, and there's a few reasons why, but that was the only show of 1981, and it would be 15 years before I had another single show year. However, what a great show it was. It was also the second of 4 consecutive summers where I saw a big festival, which of course Heatwave I've discussed. There was the Police Picnic too. Now the Police put on these big festivals. They headlined in the first outside of Toronto, then right in Toronto for 3 years. So there's Police Picnic 2 in 1982 and Police Picnic 3 in 1983. These other police picnics were much more degenerate and adventuresome affairs. Now, the one in 1981, the first one, for me anyway, this was more of a June Cleaver style experience for us. I don't think we had any drugs or alcohol with us that day. Decidedly different scenario from the much more refreshed circumstances of those 3 other events. Oh boy, I have some stories to tell about those other 2 police picnics, and you can read on the blog if you want to read ahead, as they are concerts 11 and 19. Certainly looking forward to recording those eventful episodes. So this 1981 festival, the first of them, while free of mind-altered shenanigans, this one is still long on great music and at least 3 killer sets, in my opinion. Now, special guests also attended the festival that day. Again, this is a couple of years before we knew each other, and he kindly stops by once again to share his memories of that day. Here's a teaser about someone he got to wave to in the crowd. So, do you have any final memories, anything else you remember from the day?
Yes, I remember seeing Catherine O'Hara there.
So, come back next time for sleeping legs, pelting patrons, a crowd-shocking performance, and Catherine O'Hara. Just a reminder that aside from the mylifeinconcert.com blog and Buzzsprout home, we also have our YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram pages, as well as Spotify, where you can also hear the podcast and mylifeinconcert.com related playlists. Like, follow, and subscribe where applicable. Thanks once again to all my regular listeners for tuning in and coming back, and welcome to the newcomers. Until next time, when we'll meet up at the next gig, this is your host, Various Artists, saying bye for now.